Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. On this week's podcast, I have tidbits, I have a finished object, a repaired object, and some organization revelations. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me across my Twitter feed. It's a link to a BBC article about a special type of muslin that hadn't been seen in 100 years. And what I mean by that is no one has been able to weave this type of fabric for 100 years. The knowledge of how to do it has been lost, and the knowledge of how to make the threads that are used to weave this fiber have been lost, and the cotton that was grown to produce the fiber that the thread was spun from was extinct. And so it was something that had been made for thousands of years. It was well known, and it was sold to various places around the world. The Romans used this type of fabric themselves, and it was really expensive and highly sought after. And so I'm going to leave that article, a link to the article down below, because it's really interesting to read about what this muslin was like, and also the man who is trying to revive it and bring that skill back and bring back the cotton that could produce this fabric is interesting. But there was one thing in the article that I found confusing, which was when they were talking about how fine the fabric is. They were talking about thread count, and they said that this Dhaka muslin had a thread count of 300, which means that there are 300 threads per square inch. So in every inch there are 150 threads horizontal and 150 vertical. And they talked about this as being an order of magnitude finer than anything that we see today. And I found that confusing because 300 thread count sheets are very common, and some manufacturers will even claim that they have 600, 900, 1200 thread count. And so I thought there's something that I'm missing, or there's something about that terminology that does not agree. Like whatever the bedsheet manufacturers are using as thread count is not what they're talking about in this article. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, sheet manufacturers, when they talk about thread count, they're counting every single ply in a thread rather than counting the thread as one thread, and the thread could be made up of 2 or 3 plies. They're not counting it that way, and that's how they fudge the numbers. And then on top of it, they just exaggerate how many threads they have per inch. So I think that's useful to know before you read the article, but again, I will leave that down below. In the past couple of weeks, I've had some tidbits about different types of thread buttons that were made in different parts of Europe up until about the mid to late 19th century. And somebody posted a link to another type of thread button in my Ravelry group that was very common in the 1700s, the 18th century. And those are called death head buttons. Some places they call them death's head buttons. They're similar to the Dorset buttons and the other buttons that I have been talking about the past few weeks, with the exception that in this case, instead of forming the button around a ring, which is how the Dorset buttons had been done, the thread was wound around this ring. In this case, there's a button mold that is a disc, like a solid disc with a tiny hole in the center, and the thread is wrapped around the outside, the circumference of the button instead. So I'm going to put a picture of a painting that there are a lot of paintings from the 18th century of men in their finery and that have these types of buttons, and I tried to find one that would allow you to see clearly what that pattern was. But I'm also going to link to a couple of different videos on how to make these it's amazing to me how many different ways people were using thread and some sort of a button form in order to make buttons up until about the mid 19th century when machines started manufacturing buttons instead. So last month I told you guys about a live stream that Clara Parkes was going to do in conjunction with Tolt Yarn, which is based out in Washington State. And Clara Parkes lives in Maine, but she's an expert on wool and yarn, but mostly anything made from wool and how it's manufactured. She's a real expert. And she hinted in that presentation that there was going to be something called the Wool Channel. And I remember writing it down on a note, and I had it on my desk, and I was looking at it a week or two later as I was clearing my desk. And I was like, what is the Wool Channel? What is this? And I looked it up online, and I went, oh, this is something Clara's doing that she mentioned is coming out, coming soon. And so it showed up in my Instagram feed this week. Clara finally announced it. And what it is, it's a website that is user supported. There's different forms of membership. So you can have a free membership where you can subscribe to a weekly newsletter about different things going on in the world of wool. Or you can support the website with a monthly subscription. It's like $8 per month, or you can pay for a whole year and then it's $89. So you get a bit of a discount if you pay upfront for the whole year. And what there is then is there's a community, and there's all different topics about wool that you can get into deep discussions with, and there's forums and different ways of communicating with people and finding out things about wool if you would like. So I'm going to leave a link to that down below. And like I said, you can just subscribe to the free newsletter and get a bit of news every week, or you can really take a deep dive into wool by being a paid subscriber of the site. It looks really cool, and I've already found some really amazing pieces of information that I was unaware of before that. This next tidbit is about the Livestock Conservancy. This is apparently a US-based organization. So some of their programs will be available to anybody, and some of them are going to be available only to people in the US. But their goal is to protect endangered livestock and poultry breeds from extinction. So I heard about them on the Wool Channel. Somebody was mentioning that they have a free course on how to look for, what to look for in wool when you're shopping for wool, like if you're buying fleece or whatever, like what are the qualities, what are the things to look for. So I'm going to leave links to the Livestock Conservancy, but also to the page where you can see their course. They have 3 courses, 2 of them are free. And one of them costs something. But they have a lot of other resources and programs. One of the ways that you can get involved is through this project called Shave 'em to Save 'em. Now this is something I'd heard of before, but I didn't really know anything else about it. I didn't know it was through this Livestock Conservancy, and I didn't know how to learn more about it. And so what they have is they're hooking up fiber artists with breeders who are breeding these sheep that are in danger of extinction. And so creating a market for these farmers so that they're not losing money by trying to keep these breeds from going extinct. So that's really cool. So there's a few links that I'll leave down below. But if you want to learn more about wool, or how you can learn more about rare breeds, or what you can do as a fiber artist in selecting wool breeds, I think that Livestock Conservancy organization is really a good resource. Last weekend, the Knitting and Crochet Guild of the UK had a Zoom program on knitted underwear that was presented by one of their members who has a huge collection of published patterns starting from the early 19th century. And so she was going through different patterns that were for different types of knitted underwear in different eras. So I'd seen a lot of the 19th century type of underwear previously, but I had not seen the underwear that she was showing later in the program that was called health underwear. And apparently this was something that was hugely popular in the UK. It's not anything I have ever seen before or heard of before. I certainly didn't see it in any of the vintage books that I have from the 1940s that were published in the UK. There was a lot of knitted underwear in there and knitted bathing suits and that sort of thing, but it was all wool. This underwear was like a cotton mesh underwear, and I'll put a photo of one of the patterns. It was something that everybody in the family would wear, and I don't know like where it came from or what the history behind this underwear was. But there was specific types of yarn that were created for health underwear. And so I don't know if it was some company, like a cotton company, that was like, what are we going to do with this surplus? How are we going to get rid of it? And let's make up health underwear. I don't know. I have no idea where this idea came from. But I thought it was fascinating. Because this was a program that was put on by the Knitting and Crochet Guild, they did record it, but you have to be a member of the Knitting and Crochet Guild in order to see it. The Knitting and Crochet Guild has a lot of resources. They have a huge collection of patterns. They have the entire collection of Peyton's patterns, and you can request copies of them that if you are a member. So there's a lot of vintage stuff that is available to members, but including that particular recording if you're interested in seeing that. So I have a finished object this week. It's this 1898 hat that was in progress last week. I have it modeled on my head, my disembodied head. So I made a few changes to the pattern. I was talking about this pattern last week. This is one of the few projects I've ever made, not just twice, but multiple times. I typically don't like to make things more than once. But this hat pattern is really great in cold climates. So the way it's constructed is that this band right here is in garter stitch. And so it's actually folded over. It's created in one wide piece, and in the center portion right here, those stitches are slipped on the wrong side. So it looks kind of like an I-cord along the edge here. I don't know if you can see, this kind of looks like I-cord there. That's where those slipped stitches are. So you create this band, and then when it's done, you graft the two ends together, but it folds in half like that. And then what you do is you pick up stitches along the edge all the way around in order to knit the stockinette crown. Now I made a couple of changes. One of the changes I made was, rather than when the band is done and you fold it in half, the instructions will have you pick up stitches along that slipped stitch edge, going through both layers of the fabric. So you'd stick your needle, if this is the selvage stitch, you'd stick your needle right under there through both pieces of fabric, and then you'd knit the crown. And what I did is I wanted to create a double layer of fabric for the crown of the hat. This is for our guild's service project, so we're making hats for the homeless. And here in Minnesota, the winters are very cold, and it's really important to have the hats be made of wool and that the ear portion be double thick fabric, but I thought that the top would be nice to have double thick as well. So what I did along that edge is that rather than going from the right side of the outside and going through both layers of fabric to pick up stitches, I only went through one layer and I did it from the inside, from the wrong side. So I picked up stitches from the wrong side along that selvage, and that's what caused the slip stitch to be seen along here. And I think it makes a nice decorative element, a nice transition between the garter stitch that's going in this direction and the stockinette stitch that's going in that direction. So after I knit the crown, then I came back to the headband part, and then I went from the wrong side through to the other slipped selvage stitch to pick up stitches. Once I've picked up stitches all the way around, I do a wrap and turn like for a short row so that the right side will be facing, and it connects the end of the round to the beginning of the round, and then the right side will be facing, and you can do the stockinette portion. So I did the same thing for the inside of the hat as well. The inside of the hat, I was not going to have enough of the skein. I used Cascade 220, and I was not going to have enough to do both the outside hat and the inside hat. And so I decided, instead of using as much as I had and then switching to a different yarn for the very top, that I would just use a different yarn for the entire lining. And what I used was this Zwart Bless yarn that I had. It was a natural color. It's a black sheep, but it's very dark brown is what it is in reality. I used that yarn to make an Aran sweater for myself that I finished recently, and I had some leftover yarn. I had plenty of leftover yarn. So I used some of that to make this inside lining. And what I like about it is that it's a woolen spun yarn, which means that it is going to be warmer. So that's going to just add another element of warmth to the hat. What sometimes people do with these kind of hats is when they make a double layer like that, is that for the garter stitch headband, they will do stripes. So they have two colors, and they'll do a ridge of garter stitch in one color, and then they'll change colors and do it again. So they have two colors for the headband, and then they'll do the outer hat in one of those colors and the inner hat in the other color, which is, I think, a pretty neat effect. So the other thing I wanted to mention is how I happen to block this hat. I wanted to talk about how I block hats. So I soak them with a little bit of wool wash, let them soak for a long time. I think I forgot about this one. It was just soaking overnight. I squeezed the water out and rolled it up in a towel to get as much out as I could. And then I just put it on this bald head thing that I got from a local surplus store. I do have a styrofoam head, which is really a wig head, but this is a little smaller in circumference. I wanted something that was the size of an actual head, so I have one head that's small and one head that's medium. And so I put the hat on here to dry. It's plastic and it would dry just fine. When I have to wash and block hats for an infant or a child, so it's a smaller head than one of these forms would work for, what I do a lot of times is I have a balloon, and I just blow up the balloon until it just fills the hat. I don't want to stretch the hat out at all. I just want to fill the hat. And that allows the hat to sit on something round. I can put the balloon then on a wide mouth mug or cup or something like that, and it can just sit on that balloon while it dries. And what that does is it helps to avoid fold lines. It just creates a nice rounded shape for the hat. Again, I don't want it to be stretched out while it's drying. I just want it to look nice when it's finished. I was talking last week about how I have accumulated a small pile of things that need to be repaired. And I have not been one to repair things in the past. Most of the things that kind of get holes in them tend to be socks. And I have probably 35 or 40 pairs of hand knit socks. I have so many of them that I don't really need to fix them. By the time they get a hole in them, they're 10, 12 years old. And I'm like, how long does a pair of socks need to last? But I have had a couple of sweaters wear through the elbow this winter, and so I wanted to fix those sweaters because they're favorites, and I wanted to figure out how to prevent it. So last week I was talking about how a friend of mine suggested I sew a tube of polar fleece, keep it up here, and just slip it over my sleeve when I'm sitting at my desk, because it's sitting at my desk that's causing the holes. I tend to lean my elbow on my desk chair on the armrest. Now, probably 4 or 5 people said, why don't you just cover the armrest instead? That way you don't have to put this tube on. And the problem is the armrest isn't what's moving. It's my elbow that's moving. And it's my elbow that is getting the friction, and putting polar fleece over the armchair, the armrest of the chair isn't going to keep my sweater from rubbing up against anything. So the idea is to prevent the sweater from rubbing by putting something snug over the arm that will not move against the sweater, but will move as my arm is moving, and the polar fleece is what's going to rub up against the arm of the chair. So this is the first thing that I fixed. Now this sweater had a couple of challenges. Number one, it's a single yarn, which is one of the reasons it wore through after just a couple of years. There's, the more plies you have, the more tightly twisted it is, the more hard wearing it's going to be. Plus it was 20, 25 years old when I used it to knit with. So the yarn was old. It's a single yarn. It's on the edge of bulky, super bulky as well. And then the other challenge is that this has the reverse stockinette side out. So it's the purl side that is facing on the outside. So there are a number of different ways that you can repair things. And I know theoretically how to do them. But stitch pattern is always an issue, and visibility, and is it going to be thick? Is it going to look like knitting? Is it going to be pretty hidden? What is there a color match? Do I have the same yarn or not? So these are all sort of things I have to kind of weigh out. What I decided to do with this was to duplicate stitch over the parts that were very thin. Now there are a number of ways that you can do something like this, and the way I chose to do it is not one that I have seen anywhere. It's just one that made sense to me, and it made sense to me because I was creating a structure of stitches because it was very worn through. I was really worried that as I was pulling this thick yarn through and trying to duplicate stitch over the top of the existing ones, that the ones that were very thin and barely holding together, I was afraid that that I'd just be putting too much friction and tension on them and they might break and it might make it harder. So what I did was I used brightly colored fingering weight yarn, so it's thinner yarn, to kind of trace the path that I needed to make with the thicker yarn. And I did it in bright colors, so it'd be very easy to see. I did a different color for each of the rows. So I created this grid of where I wanted to replace it or where I wanted to duplicate stitch. Then I duplicate stitched over the colored threads, and then I removed the colored threads. Now, again, this isn't something I invented myself. And it's not without its problems. It did create a rather thick patch, which I will show you a picture of. It's not that noticeable. First of all, it's dark and it's near, my underarm, and it's creating some resistance to being rubbed through again when I have my elbow on there. So I don't mind it. If you look at it just on its own, it looks a little weird. But I think it worked really well. The other things I have to repair have their own complications. I have this Aran sweater where the sleeve is in moss stitch. So that's a more complicated stitch pattern. And for this one, after I saw how thick that made this, I decided I wasn't going to do that with, I found my original swatch. This is the only yarn I have. This is 15 years old. I do have some of this yarn, but I didn't want that sort of visible thick patch. And I decided I'm going to cover this with a suede elbow patches on both sides. So that's another thing I have to figure out how I'm going to sew those on. But in the meantime, what I need to do underneath there is just kind of make sure that I stabilize the strands of yarn there. And for that, I think what I'm going to do is use a fingering weight sock yarn that's a close color, but it's not even going to be seen. But because of the nylon, that will help stabilize it as well. Somebody else had suggested that for my other sweaters that don't have a problem yet, that maybe I could use like that reinforcing yarn that you use for socks to strengthen them. And the problem with my sweaters is typically that they're not in stockinette like a sock is, where you can usually use the purl bumps on the reverse side of the work to kind of weave in this reinforcing yarn so that's not visible on the right side of the work. And the stitch patterns complicate that. So I'm just not sure what I'm going to do about some of the other things, but the polar fleece sleeve is probably going to be what I use when I'm in my office. But otherwise, I need to repair this. So the swatch of yarn, I'm going to take out this neck, pull it out, and then re-knit it so that it's deeper and narrower, so that I don't pick up as many stitches, or I can pick up as many but decrease some of them out in the first round, so that it doesn't like go so as wide as it is. And I have this extra yarn that I'll be able to make it a deeper neck, so that it's just a little too shallow for my taste. Now there was another problem I had with this sleeve, which is that I made the cuffs kind of narrow, and they come right to the end of my wrist. So there's no extra yarn in there, but it is a pretty rigid bind off because I knit this top down. A couple of people have suggested that I use this swatch yarn to fix the cuffs, and I'm not going to be able to really make them any bigger. What I might be able to do is take the bind off chain out and then replace it with an outline stitch bind off, which is it's a type of sewn bind off that is just like the smooth side of a long tail cast on, and it has a lot of stretch. So I might do that. We'll see how the neck goes. So I'm going to repair the elbow with sock yarn, cover the elbows with suede patches, fix the neck, and then, assuming I have some yarn left, see what I can do about changing the bind off of this edge here. So that's that. And then I have a couple of really fine gauge machine knit sweaters that are my husband's that have some like actual holes in them. And so for those, I'm going to use one of several different darning techniques that I've seen many times in different books. But the one that I think is the best was from a book called The Encyclopedia of Needlework. It was published in 1885. I'm going to leave a link down to where I got it, because it's been digitized. I think it's on archive.org, but certainly I got it as a digitized form. And it has the same diagram that I've seen over and over and over and never quite been able to figure out how it actually works. But they have probably 3 different approaches for how to repair these things. And the way that they're repairing them is not with that woven method of darning, where it's a replacement for the hole, but in basically weaving yarn in. Instead, it's replacing the fabric with what looks like more fabric, but without extra bulk in it. So what I'm going to do for my husband's sweaters, they're very fine gauge, very dark color. I'm going to practice on some swatches. I have a bin full of swatches. A lot of them are a light color, and then I'll be able to just practice on those and then kind of get my technique really figured out and practice on those. And if I ruin the swatch, it doesn't matter. It's a swatch. And once I really understand what I'm doing and have the hang of the whole process, then I'll be able to transfer that to the actual sweater, and hopefully can do a decent job of repairing those. Those machine knit sweaters, those are ones where I don't have yarn that matches them. I went to a needlework store yesterday and got little tiny skeins of not embroidery floss, but like yarn that's meant for doing needlepoint of different types, and got some colors that were as close as I could get to them, and I won't have to separate out plies or try to do anything like that when I am able to fix them. So my other project that I've been working on for a couple of weeks is how to use my office to do sewing, because I've been wanting to get back into sewing. So I've been watching a lot of videos about sewing. I've been reading a lot of material about sewing, but I hadn't done any sewing. And part of that was because I hadn't figured out how to set this room up to do that, because I can't have it set up permanently for sewing. It has to be a situation where I can take my sewing equipment out easily, and then when I'm done with the project, that I can easily put it away. So that was really stumping me. That was a problem I was trying to work out in my brain. And then the other thing I was trying to work out was how to store my sewing notions, like how to organize them. And so I was asking you guys for tips last week, and you gave me tons of them. And what's so interesting is that I realize how organization is dependent on the stuff you have, the space you have, what you use it for and how you use it, like the kinds of projects that you're making. And then you have to combine that with personality. So like as I was explaining last week, I'm not a tidy person, but I am organized. So when I figure out where something should live, like I know where it is, and I know how to get it. I know where to put it when it needs to be put away. I'm not the kind of person who needs to have every surface absolutely empty and will just shove things into boxes and closets and drawers in order to keep a clean surface. My surface is messy, but my containers tend to be pretty organized. And I was just really struggling with how to do this. All over the years, I bought so many different types of storage containers of different types to try to keep things organized, and it wasn't working. A couple of you clued me in on a YouTube channel called Just Get It Done Quilting. And the woman who runs that website or that YouTube channel, her name is Karen Brown. And she spoke to me in a way that completely made sense to me. So I need my organization to be functional. I don't care as much about aesthetics. It isn't that I don't like things to look nice. It's that if they look nice but they're not functional, it doesn't matter. So function has to come first, and then is there a way to make it prettier or nicer, or what is it that I'd like to be able to look at? But first and foremost is function. When she started talking about sewing organization, she was talking about that you have like 3 stations, that you need to set up this like work triangle. Sort of like how a kitchen works, where you have your refrigerator, your sink, and your stove, and that needs they need to be nearby each other, and they need to be easy to get from one to another, that kind of thing. And the thing is, I had never, ever thought about sewing in that way. And that's because I have never seen a cutting station until I started watching some YouTube videos in the past year of people who do historical sewing. And all these people have these giant cutting tables that are like they're like the height of my desk that I have. I have like what could be a standing desk. So I can stand or I can sit in a tall chair. But I would never clear my desk off to try to use it as a cutting table. That is never going to happen. And I don't have room for another one of those. But I was fascinated by that concept of a cutting table. Because let me tell you, what we did when I was growing up, and what I've always done, is I've used the floor. Like when I was a kid, we used the living room floor. And in my house, where I live, I've always used the kitchen floor because there's the biggest space to lay out all the fabric. And at first, when I was making things like Halloween costumes for my kids when they were little, all my sewing went on in the kitchen. So typically what I would do is I'd take my fabric, I'd wash it in the laundry room. When it came out, I would iron it at the ironing table. I'd take the fabric up to the kitchen, I'd bring the ironing board and iron up to the kitchen. I'd bring my sewing machine up to the kitchen. And so I could iron, I could do the pressing while I was sewing. And then when it was time for dinner, I had to take everything off the table, and we'd eat dinner, and then we'd clean the table really well, and then I'd set up my sewing again. And so then when I was done with the project, when I was done with Halloween costumes, pack it all back up, take it all back down to the basement. So then a number of years ago, we have a room down in the basement. It's the only finished room, and it was set up as a dark room in the 1970s. And so it has walls and a door, and it has a big overhead light. It had a really bad 1970s fluorescent light, but I thought that's a place where I can contain all of my like craft supplies. So that was where I contained my knitting at first, until I realized I don't knit in there. I don't see my yarn. I don't notice them. If I need to knit something, I would just go to the shop and buy what I needed. And so that was when I took all of my knitting out of that room. And then that room continued to be my sewing room. It was kind of close to the iron. It was maybe 15 feet away from the iron and ironing board. If I was sewing, I'd still have to get way up, walk way across the basement to do the ironing, come back and do the sewing. And I still was cutting all of my fabric upstairs. So this idea of these 3 stations and how they have to be conveniently located with each other was something I'd never once considered. So Karen has a series of 4 videos on organizing your sewing space. And one of them is on organizing your sewing for small spaces. Like if you are in the situation I'm in, where I'm not going to have the sewing stuff out all the time, it has to be some place that's easy to put away and easy to take out, otherwise you'll never do it. And so that was one of the things I was struggling with. I have plenty of room to store everything, but it was like, how am I going to take it out and how am I going to do all that? So she really solved that issue for me. And she had this like little cart, like it's a 3-shelf wire cart. And I realized I don't have to keep my sewing machine in the case. When I have it put away, I can keep it on one of those shelves and just roll it into the closet. And then when I need to have it, roll it out, and I can keep all of the must-have notions on that cart, like my sewing machine needles, my pin cushions, little snips when you're sewing and you need to snip your threads off. Another thing that was a complete revelation to me was the idea of a thread catcher, like a little bin that you just, when you're cutting your threads, you put them in instead of letting them land on your clothing or the floor. Like, who knew? So I've been figuring all of this out and I'm getting it sorted out. And I thought, once I got everything kind of organized, I thought, okay, so I'm going to see what it's like to pull everything out, set it up, and then sew a little project. So I made myself some pattern weights. So like if you want to cut out fabric, or if you just want to weigh the fabric down, like if you are trying to iron some fabric and it's hanging down and you don't want it to fall over the edge, you can put these weights on them. It's just filled with rice. But it was like I could try out my my machine, do a small project, make something useful, see how things were working, and see how I'm going to need to reorganize, or if I need what I need to do. So that's one of the things that she pointed out. Just because you get it organized doesn't mean it's going to be right, and that it needs to stay that way forever. And I've noticed that with my knitting, like this is not working. Where would be a better place for that? And I typically don't move things unless I'm doing a big reorganize. But now I'm realizing I need to pay attention to if something's not convenient, if it's bugging me, see if I can solve the problem. See if there's a different place I can store something, and see if that makes more sense to me. And so I've just been expanding all of this thinking to include my sock drawer and my sweater storage, which are my 2 big hand knit categories. My dresser has all of these drawers that are about the same, and then the top one is narrow. That's my sock drawer, but it's at eye level. So I have we have these like big cabinets that take up a whole wall. And my sock drawer is right here. So in order for me to see into it, I needed to be on my tiptoes to look into it. And so it's really hard to organize it unless I'm on a step stool, and then I can put things away, and that is not convenient. So what I do is I bring up all my socks after I've washed them. They're all in my hand. I open that drawer and I just slap them in there. It doesn't work. So the organization system of rolling them in a pair and having them so you can see them from above only works if you can see them from above. This is a Marie Kondo idea, this joy of tidying up. The thing is, my t-shirt drawer, which I learned how to organize 4 years ago by folding my shirts in a certain way and then filing them, totally works. Love it. Every time I'm folding up my shirts, I fold them up in the way that makes it so that I can file them in that drawer. And that's because it's easy, it's convenient, it motivates me to continue doing that because it's so convenient. Sock drawer, not so much. So I sat there today and I thought, well, the socks don't have to be up there. First of all, there's so many socks, I can barely get the drawer closed. And I have another drawer that's much bigger that has like 2 sweatshirts and a pair of sweatpants in them, I'm just going to swap drawers, and then I'll be able to do the organization. And then the other thing was my sweaters. I have a lot of hand knit sweaters, and the only place that I can stack all of those sweaters is in the cabinet above that sock drawer. So it's me folding it and then opening this drawer and trying to, shove it in there. And then if I need to get one out, it's pulling everything out. So what do? I don't put them away until spring when I'm not wearing them. Instead, I take them off, I put them on a couch that's right at the end of our bed, or if I'm in the bathroom, I hang them over the edge of the tub, because it's too much of a pain to put them up in that shelf. It's just inconvenient. So now I realize, oh, my closet is practically empty because I don't have that many clothes that I need to hang up anymore. I'm at home all the time. And I can put one of those of clothing, it's like cubes, fabric cubes that hang from the hang rod all the way down, and I can just stack my clothes, and my closet's right outside the bathroom. And so that is a very convenient place for me to take sweaters out and put them back in, because I can see them and I can reach them. So if it's convenient for me, I will use that system. So I'm trying to just be mindful of that now, is that I can always tweak things. And if I'm not putting something away, part of that is I'm not naturally tidy, but part of that is it's inconvenient. So how can I make it convenient to put something away? So I'm going to try hard to really pay attention to these things, and then continue tweaking my sewing and spinning corner that I have set up in this room. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.